Well, welcome.
Thank you.
Rabbi Jan Salzman. We're here today to talk about your experience in the Red Brick Synagogue on Archibald Street. And it's important to know that you were the last practicing rabbi to use that space before it came into non-Jewish use. Do you remember the first time you entered the Red Brick Synagogue?
I do. I'd never been in the building, although I lived across the street from it. And I live in great-grandma Rachel Cohn's house. So I live in part of a Jewish community in that neighborhood. It was amazing. You know, just like all holy spaces that are built, usually, you walk in and there's an uplift of the eyes, right? That's how churches are built. They really like, whoosh, your eyes go up. In this case, the eyes go up to a smaller ceiling, like you feel held. You know, it's not vast. You don't feel insignificant, right? I didn't feel insignificant. I felt held. And then when I would sing, wow, the sound in there was just amazing. And then I was there in the context of hanging out with all these old guys, you know, who had been kept it running since 1952. And there's something about a minion of older men who've worked so hard to maintain a community is so beautiful. And so I was midwifed by those men into the feeling of what that building is, not just the architecture. The architecture was stunning, but I was introduced to what it felt like to be part of this Jewish community that was admittedly dying off, and they were really, like I said, they were really happy to have us use the space.
Can you describe the components of the architecture that were specific to that space?
Well, part of it was they had, what was her name? Ida, I can't remember her last name. I did her funeral. She had paid for the renovation in the 60s, I think, and they put up this faux Jerusalem stone cardboard. I don't know what it was made of, you know. And so they made it look like you were surrounded by Jerusalem soul. So the colors were gold, just really beautiful golden. And the ark, as you can see behind me, had a lot of gold in it. There was a nice, a drape. There was, as behind me, there was the stand in front of it, steps, those copper things, and the copper lampposts. And it was just surrounded by these windows also that are the same windows as the First Congregational Church down across from the library, because it was the same architect. And who, by the way, put a Jewish star in that church because he liked the Jewish star shape so much that after he did, and then there's another story about that building is that these tall, like beautiful arched windows like that had the panes, and when the Jewish population walked in, they said those look like crosses, and so the architect stuck diagonal 90-degree pieces at a 45-degree angle into the top of the window, so it didn't look quite like a cross. It's very, very sweet. But what we added was a rug, so that it kind of brought the room together in a very soft, we added softness. So that there would be something to, and then of course then there was the bima in the middle, which was the table where Torah was written. So what was interesting about the architecture is that it was built before it became common, although it was already getting common, to put everything up front, like to imitate churches, right? So the minister is up front, everything's happening up front. In the Jewish shtetl tradition, in the European little synagogue on every corner, the Torah was read in the middle of the room, not up front. And that creates such an incredible feeling of the community surrounding what is the pinnacle of a service in some ways, of taking the Torah out and reading that so that the bima, it's called a bima, in the middle of the room was very unique. And you didn't see that anywhere unless you were in a synagogue that was built before 1900. Okay? Because the immigrants who built Ahavat Garam were recreating the Lithuanian style architecture, topography of the synagogues that they left back in the old country. These were not grand churches that they were leaving behind in the old country. These were just the people, right? The little shtibela. And so there was something unique about that architecture that recalled so deeply and so physically the experience that the immigrants had coming to this new country and creating a space that looked like home.
And what did they sit on?
Oh, they sat on benches, on pews. But we can move the pews around. When they redid the floor the first time, they never bolted the pews back, down. So we used to move the pews all over the place. They sat on pews. You could seat approximately, I don't know, maybe 75 people on those pews if you needed to. And then we would supplement with chairs.
And what about the balconies?
So the mechitza, where women would sit, were shorter pews that all faced forward. The challenge there is that only if you were in the first row could you see what was going on down below. It was not meant for women's participation in the service. That's just what the architecture reflected that. That's gone. Orthodox communities still observe that. Modern Orthodox communities don't put the women in the back but they put them side by side. So you're not quite. Modern Orthodoxy has changed a lot of that lack of egalitarian access.
So, do you remember what year it was when you first walked into that building?
Well, Ruach HaMakom forms in 2016. I had served at Ohavi Zedek for 6 years, I think it was, from 2010 to 2016 as the cantor and assistant rabbi. And then it was time for me to leave, which was a good thing, actually, because I was really ready to lead my own, be a rabbi, and not a cantor as much. But I had been in there before, I think, just for...
It sounds like it.
I remember. There was a time when Rabbi Joshua Chasen and the Chabad rabbi and the Reform Temple rabbi at that time was Rabbi Glazer, and so I was there. We did a community-wide, I think it was a memorial for the Holocaust of some kind of thing. And that was the first time I was in there professionally. And then when we formed Ruach HaMakom, the owners of, we call it AG, Ahavat Garam, actually somebody here said, well, go talk, Oren, I can't remember his last name. He said, go talk to the folks over at AG and see if you can use their space. And sure enough, they were very interested. So we took over paying all the utilities and kind of the upkeep of the building, but they didn't charge us any rent. And so that allowed our fledgling organization, Ruach HaMakom, which the name means a spirit of the place, to begin a Jewish renewal community in Burlington. So it was very lovely. Yeah.
Nice. What was it like to lead services in that space?
Well, first of all, the acoustics were stunning. We had friends who recorded their CDs in that place because it was such a stunning acoustic experience. There was, we were surrounded by the artifacts of the previous generations. We see it here behind me. The stenders, the podiums that you stand at. It all was from a time past being repurposed for what was happening now. I loved being in there. It was small enough to feel, it was a human scale. Quite often churches and synagogues are built with these high ceilings, which means they're lovely, but you can't hear the person singing next to you. So the acoustics were astounding. We never used microphones, no matter how, I don't want to say never, but primarily not ever used microphones, even if there were 100 people in that room, because it was acoustically perfect. It was created before microphones were invented. And so all over Vermont and New Hampshire, you have these opera houses, the Randolph Chandler Music Hall, et cetera, that were built before microphones. And so it was so lovely. And then there was that sense, the people who owned the building, Ahavat Gerim, they still met on Saturday, once a month on Saturday morning, so they were still holding that spiritual space. I would join them to, it was a lay-led service. It just felt like I was picking up on all of those people who had been there. The plaques on the walls had names of people I recognized from being here at OZ. It felt like being part of a really delicious community, just carrying on in a space that had been constructed for that purpose, to come together in prayer and comfort. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the Ruach HaMakom congregation? Who came, who was attracted, what was different about renewal, what kind of place that filled in the constellation of Jewish experience in Vermont?
So Jewish renewal begins in the 60s as part of the Chavarah movement, people leaving synagogues or maybe never having gone to synagogues to meet in each other's living rooms to Jew, whatever that meant, that verb meant. And Jewish renewal is the first form of Judaism ever co-created by women. It was post-Holocaust, so it was an American experience. Women had full equality, obviously. It grew in the soil of democracy, of equal access under the law. It pulled the Hasidic lineage through Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi of blessed memory. He had been in the Hasidic world in Europe and left and brought it here and found a very fertile ground in the youth of America who were searching for spiritual experiences, not necessarily liturgical. So when I was raised in the conservative movement, I was bat mitzvahed in 1966, and on a Friday night, they didn't give girls Saturday yet, but the Jewish practice had really died. It was just dead in the water because of the Holocaust. People were just so wounded. So Jewish renewal arises out of the desire for a spiritual experience in this ancient lineage. And so it had a lot to do with being a laboratory. We're going to try this, we're going to try that. We'll see. It was very loose and goosey, and it was a great time. Now it's got the largest seminary in the country is now the Jewish Renewal Seminary. So it's gone through a lot. And so what the people who were, I think there were two things why people came. First is I'm a charismatic person. I strive and just comes out of me as I was raised, it's who I am, so that when you walk in the door, I let you know that I'm so glad you're here. And also being trained by other charismatic leaders that how to make the engagement, how do I work with those who are sitting before me or around me so that they feel like they are actually inside what's happening. In other words, I'm not looking at the back of the room, I'm looking at people. So the way I was trained had a lot to do with it, not just my own charismatic personality. And secondly, a lot of people either had no Jewish experience or what they had been raised in or what was available here in town did not fulfill them spiritually. So we're really talking about a sense of spirit. And what do I mean by spirit? It is to experience what is happening, not just with your intellect, because if you have just your intellect, you can argue with everything that's written in the book, right? All of us argue with what's in the book. Patriarchal monarchy is not our zeitgeist, right? So there's issues. And so Ruach HaMakom begins with my training in Jewish renewal to make a portal through which anyone could walk whose heart so moved them. We have in the Torah that the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, Moses says, people bring stuff to build the tabernacle, whoever's heart so shall move them. In other words, a heart-driven enterprise. And so, and my husband Laredo, also very gregarious, we just had a really good time. And my role is to be a good hostess. I'm so glad you came, I hope you come back, right? I mean, that's it. That's at the bottom line. Forget whatever words we say. And the other thing that was important is that most people don't have any training in Hebrew. So Jewish renewal teaches, you just take out the one or two lines from a psalm And Rabbi Sheffa Gold really pioneered this. And we'll just sing that line over and over and over again until you allow that chant to shift something inside of you. And I think that was really important because there's a lot of shame around not knowing Hebrew liturgy for Jews. And that shame, even if they can't articulate that, they feel that shame. It's there, because if you walk in and everybody's blah, 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 you know another language, and you feel completely inadequate and mystified, and you walk out the door because there's shame. You should have learned this, how come you don't know it? And Jewish renewal allows entry into the portal. Also through the body, we do improvisational dance, we do art, we do all kinds of other ways to engage the whole person. And so that, I think is all I want to say. I'm not sure yeah?
Yeah. And I think as a member of the congregation, I can add that it attracted a fascinating cross-section of people.
Yeah.
There were old people, there were young people, there were young families, there were young professionals. So that people, and I was actually surprised at the number of people who did know Hebrew and were able to pray in Hebrew. I was amazed just to find that was true. There were people who simply, for one reason or another, had not, as you suggested, found a home in the other congregations available to them.
And I think the other ingredient that we had is that we'd have a potluck after every service. So every clergy understands that the real church happens at coffee hour after the service. And that it was really, really important for us as we were beginning the congregation that there be a potluck meal after. And oh my gosh, when we were in the old building, we they had those pews and we set them up so that kind of circular. And in the back there were tables set up. And we would gather and eat there till 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, and we'd pound on the table and we'd talk, and kids would be running around. And that, in fact, was the experience. Whatever we did liturgically, very nice. We had a lovely hour together. We sang. But what really made Ruach HaMakom, I think, was this communal eating, where vegetarian, potluck, and then Laredo and I would take the dishes home and run the dishes through our dishwasher, which was possibly not the best thing to do in terms of the responsibilities of the rabbi. But we wanted to make it as easy as possible.
And what days did those meals happen?
Well, Friday night. So we met twice a month. We met on the second and fourth Fridays of every month. When I worked at Ohavi Zedek for 6 years, and I worked every weekend. I thought, when I'm setting up my own congregation, I want to work every weekend. So we said second and fourth Friday night. In the beginning, we tried to do some Saturday morning as well. We did yoga and some Torah study, and that room in the daytime was stellar. So the building itself was lovely at night, very nice. Architecture, we put lighting up all over the place. In the daytime, the morning, light just streamed through all of those windows. The room was always lit because there were windows all around the room. And to be there at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning doing yoga and studying Torah and stuff, it was heavenly. The room itself was golden because of the walls that they had put the fake Jerusalem stone up. It was a golden room, and daylight was incredible. Yeah.
Can you describe the stained glass windows?
The stained glass windows were fun. So there was one that wasn't so stained up above the ark, and then the one above the entrance had primary colors, and so when the sun would shine through that, you'd see those colors. So it was very lovely, very lovely. Yeah.
So in addition to Kabbalat Shabbat, some holidays were celebrated in that space as well.
That's right. So we had the first wild Seder, Passover Seder. Loretta, what was the number? Like 120 people?
124.
124 people slammed into, it was so wild. So much fun. So we had Passover Seder, again, potluck, vegetarian potluck. We had Purim in there, I think. Oh no, we had the first program we had was down at Arts Riot, and with the brass balagan band. It was just crazy, wonderful stuff. Because we were just trying to, let's get out into the community. Passover, high holidays, of course. High holidays were incredible. That's when people tend to show up, and so the room was always full. And we built a sukkah. So Laredo and I used to live, when I was working at OZ, we lived for a while in the parsonage house that OZ owns, which used to be owned by Rabbi Wall, who was the rabbi who, in 1952, split from the red brick and built the current site on North Prospect. And rummaging around in the garage roof at 242 North Street, lo and behold, there was a sukkah. It was Rabbi Wall's sukkah. So Laredo and I took it down, and we schlepped it over to the synagogue and we built the sukkah. And that was just so much fun. People, and you're right out there on the street. So the joy of that building is it's not hidden up on a hill somewhere. It was right there in the middle of Jewish town, right? That's where all the Jews lived, right? The Jewish section of town. And so there was a fan, but people would stop by and kids. So I loved putting up the sukkah there. And then we would get together for some evenings for study and a little wine or something in the sukkah. So that was one. We did some Torah. So we did the whole raft of high holiday marathon.
Do you remember what year it was when we moved high holiday services from the Red Brick Synagogue to Rock Point?
Well, I think Rock Point might have been our first choice, yeah. So he did our high holiday services out at Rock Point first. So we didn't do high holidays that's right. Okay, so I'm misremembering. We didn't do it in the Red Brick. We did it at Rock Point that first year at the Sailing Center, the second year, and then
third year was at AG.
Oh, at AG, okay.
Because AG itself was leading high holidays in that space.
Oh, that's right.
So it wasn't available for us.
There you go. So what Loretta was saying is that the first couple of years, Havat Garam people were still running their own high holiday services, so we had to go someplace else. And but that also, that was an amazing thing, because I think it created a sense of community that was so expansive, especially at Rock Point, where after the service you walk on the trails. I had put all kinds of signs in the woods to help increase mindfulness about walking through the woods. You were right on the lake. It was a great place. And then, so we did at Rock Point. We did Yom Kippur and Tashlich at Rock Point again this year. So it was very sweet.
Very special.
Very sweet,
special
yeah.
place. So you married some folks during your time
Oh, yeah.
with Ruach HaMakom. Can you describe one or two of the weddings that took place in the Red Brick Synagogue?
Well, architecturally, there were, and you see them behind me, the copper light posts, right? So the copper light posts formed the basis of a chuppah at times, right? Or people would erect the chuppah in the space. Again, the room itself created a warm, intimate container for whatever was going to take place. Again, the acoustics, wow, right? And so when people would come to the weddings, they would just be starstruck at the place that they were. So you had to tell the story, and so it was walking into an historic place for your nephew's wedding added to the experience. And it really brought a lot of awareness from outside of Burlington that this place existed, and hopefully that led into donations also from people who were not in the area. But I don't have any particular memories of anything special. Weddings are like over the top, so much fun, joy.
What about the
joy.
kitchen?
The kitchen. She laughs, right? The kitchen was downstairs, and so when you walk down these like really intense stairs where there was debris. The building was a disaster. Let's put it that way. It was a disaster, but it functioned. So when you walk down the stairs, and the women's bathroom, and then right next to the women's bathroom was the mikveh, which is still there, by the way. And then you walk down a sketchy hallway, and then there was the boiler right there in the same room as the sink. Okay, and then there was another room that had a stove and a refrigerator, old school electric stove, and all these dishes. So that was the coolest thing, is that you actually could put on an event because all the dishes were there, right? And so for Passover, for example, we used those dishes, and as the evening ended, a crew would descend into the basement, headed up by Mike Jeter and a couple other people, and they just had a blast, washing dishes. It was a commercial, 3-section stainless steel. We never cooked down there. We would turn the oven on to heat food up, but it wasn't that it was unsanitary, it was just crumbling. The walls were crumbling, the floors were crumbling, it was crumbling, but it was ours and we loved it.
What was the situation with the bathrooms in the building?
Oh my God, those bathrooms were hysterical. So if you walked into the men's bathroom, you saw 3 4.5-foot tall painted orange urinals and 3 stalls. When you walked into the women's bathroom, you only had 2 stalls. So the question is, why were there more facilities for men than there were for women? And not surprisingly, in the time that this was created, the physical space of a synagogue was a male space. And it was not a female space. Women came usually in time for the Torah. They sat up in the mechitza. You needed to have some bathroom facilities because the mikveh was right next, and so women would come and use the mikveh after their menstrual cycle, following those ancient practices. People would do mikvahs for a variety of reasons, conversions, etc. So the men's bathroom had 6 places to pee. And it was such a throwback to really old, funky 1940s urinals. I used to show them all the time. They were my favorite thing in the building. Anyway, and there was a mirror, there was a sink, the bathrooms were, and in its crumbling state, there were all these really helpful bugs that were scouring the floor to keep it actually. They were the robot cleaners, that would go around and clean the bottom of the. Oh my God, it was just wild. But I've lived in a lot of funky places, and after a while, you just don't see it. There was lighting, you could see what you were doing. Oh, it was crazy.
So did you also lead some services for Ohavi Zedek when you were there?
Yeah, those once a month Saturday mornings was lay-led, and so I would do a little bit. And have someone, Bruce Hicken would do the Dvar Torah, and somebody else would daven Shacharit, and I would daven, which is one section. I would daven the opening parts of the Saturday morning service, and then we'd take the Torah out. Quite often I was reading from the Torah because I had gotten trained at Ohavi Zedek how to do that. I did that every single week. So it was lay-led, it was very loose, it was very sweet, very sweet. And then there was a little oneg, little meal after there. And, all the people who just loved that place were there. David, go ahead.
I was just going to say, can you describe a little bit what kind of congregation Ohavi Zedek was and how it was different from Ruach HaMakom?
Well, when Rabbi Wall, as part of what was going on in the rest of America post-war, the conservative movement and the reform movement were experiencing a rise in popularity, leaving behind the Orthodox practice. And so Rabbi Wall, who was a surprise hire, they were trying to hire an Orthodox rabbi. There is a story about how Rabbi Wall ended up here instead. He was trained at JTS. He had been an army chaplain, Jewish Theological Seminary. So he was from the conservative movement. Okay, so he wanted to build this building where we're sitting right now, Ohavi Zedek, And the people who wanted to remain Orthodox bought the building, I think for $10,000 in 1952, and named themselves Ahavat Gerim, lovers of strangers, okay, which is one of the foundations of Judaism. You should have love for those who are not of your own lineage. And they kept the Orthodox format for many years, and then it began to, slowly slide towards what we would call traditional conservative. So the women were no longer upstairs, people were sitting together. It was a little bit more relaxed in terms of the liturgical outline. So it transitioned from an Orthodox way of doing things to a more just what we'd call traditional conservative. And so they themselves underwent a transition.
And how many members approximately would come to services on Saturday at that point?
We usually had a minion. There were at least 10 or 12 of us, 15 sometimes. And then it slowly, over the years, they died. Right?
Right.
Yeah,
right,
I buried them. So, yeah.
Yeah, it dwindled.
It dwindled.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about the bar and bat mitzvahs that occurred there, because I know that some of them were for younger people, but some of them were not.
Yeah.
And so talk a little bit about that.
So for young people, the parents would contact me to do a bar bat mitzvah for their kids because they wanted a little bit more, they wanted a Jewish renewal format. They wanted for a variety of reasons. And at that time, also for the weddings, just to go back for the weddings for a second, I did interfaith weddings. And so did the Reform Temple, but not not Rabbi Joshua Chasen did not do that. And still the conservative movement doesn't let their rabbis do that. So that was a factor. But people hired me, they wanted something unique, and I tutored their kids and got them prepared, and we didn't do a Haftorah, the reading from the prophets. We focused on Torah. They should learn how to read from the Torah. That was a value I had. And the families agreed. And they were lovely, and so for some families, we could get 120 people in there. So and then they would go off somewhere else for their parties. For adults, especially for women, so I said I was bat mitzvahed in 1966 on a Friday night at a conservadox, what we call a synagogue that was dragged kicking and screaming to bat mitzvah girls. The community needed it, but there were a lot of women in that cohort that never had this ceremony, never had a bat mitzvah, and there were some men who missed it as well. And so over the years, I offered 2, maybe 3 cohorts of people who wanted to study and have the ceremony, go through the Shabbos morning service, learn how to read a little Torah, give a commentary. It took about a year, and it was so joyful. I shouldn't hit the microphone. It was so joyful for them to complete something that had missed them as they were growing up, either because their home congregations didn't offer B'nai Mitzvah training for girls, or their families didn't value it. So the sons got the bar mitzvah, but the girls did not. And so one way or the other, there was a wound there. And so some people came forward. Now, that cohort is my cohort, our cohort, and that need is decreasing because the generation who didn't have access to bar and bat mitzvah is receding, right? So that's aging out. And so there's, in many congregations, and we did this, I think, once. Okay, you had one already. Okay, let's have one as an adult. Wouldn't you like to do that? So we did that as well. And anytime I was able to infuse curiosity and joy in engaging in Jewish practice, that was my job. I didn't grow up with it. I grew up very, very secular. We went to synagogue 3 days a year. Right? We always had Friday night's dinner, wine and candles, but I didn't know about challah till I was in my 20s. So I was a Midwest girl. I was from Skokie, Illinois, and I didn't grow up with any of this. And so for me, I also can bring that joy of my own my own discovery.
So there are other things that were not necessarily Jewish related that took place in that space under your, your guidance and tutelage.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about sort of what the inspiration was for those things and what some of those things were?
Part of our vision for that space was to be a community space. There was a place across the street that closed that had been a place where people could rent for their kids' birthday parties or whatever. And when that closed, the Old North End really, or that section of the Old North End, really lost a place where people could just gather. Also, the acoustics of that building, as I've said over and over again, were astounding. So I thought, well, let's have concerts. And so we did. We had a chamber concert, we had poetry readings, we had book reveals, we had all kinds of art and music that, people were interested in having a space. And we didn't charge anything, so it was, again, this idea that that building at its core needed to serve the community. And so we did. We had a couple of wild times. One year we hosted the girls rock and roll finale with, some of it was a little over the top, but it was awesome. There were, in fact, Honey and Soul were, performed there for the first time, and that's where we learned about Hannah Hausman, who is not quite the musician in our community, and sang with me for High Holidays this year. Friends of mine, a kid I had known since he was in high school, turned into this incredible fiddler. He was part of Pete's Posse with Pete Sutherland, and they recorded their last album there, as far as I know. So Tristan Henderson, that was my young friend's name. So it was a place where artists loved to come. The light, again, lit up that space in a way that artificial lighting could never do. And I'm just trying to think of, it had to do with concerts, recordings, and just art, and just that feeling of this is the community space as well as ours, and how could we promote it? Ultimately it would have been a little source of income for us as well, to charge a little bit of rent, but we really just wanted to make it part of the community.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is, although we didn't charge rent, there were costs associated.
Yeah.
Can you explain why?
There were costs associated. What are you
I'm thinking about the fire marshal.
Oh, that's right. Oh, because there wasn't thank you. So there was only one door into the sanctuary. It was a fire hazard. I mean, if God forbid anything happened, there would be no way to get out. So now, Kidder Spader, who has renovated the building, has stuck a fire door, up. You can get out of there if there's a God forbid. So if there were more than, I can't remember how many people. 50. If there were more than 50 people in the building, we had to hire a fire marshal. We had to hire two. So that was $90 a person twice, right? $180 cost. That was just a cost that if you wanted to have more than 50 people in the building, you had to pay the fire marshals. They were wonderful to hang out. It was lovely. So if you had a bar bat mitzvah, if you had a wedding, part of your cost as renting the building is paying for that overhead of a fire marshal. Also someone to clean up afterwards. So we would hire out. So if you used that space, we didn't charge rent as much. Maybe we did charge rent, I can't really remember. But then the rentee would have to also pay for these other things. Fire marshal, clean up, whatever. Yeah.
Interesting.
It was great.
So did congregants ever talk to you about how the building affected them?
Oh, had I had a camera on the faces of people who walked in there for the first time. It was nourishing. If you had never been in that building, and especially if you'd grown up here and had walked by this building for all your life, but had never seen the inside, one of the most funs we had was being part of the Ramble, the Old North End Ramble. And so we would be at the synagogue and people would be coming in. They grew up here. They had never been inside the building. So when people would walk in the building, their faces would soften and it would light up, and you would just see they would look around and they were just beaming from their very soul. It really was a nourishing moment when people walked in for the first time. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, very cool.
So, do you think that it will be possible to recreate some sense of what that space was like if we're able to accomplish the renovations we're thinking about here at Ohavi Zedek?
Well, I think it's worth a try. Absolutely. And I think that there will be some obviously hard to replicate, the acoustics being the most obvious for me. But you know, if you go to a museum, like in the Jerusalem Museum, you walk into displays that are the recreation of a temple in Damascus that was moved piece by piece and re-erected. I don't remember it was Damascus, but they have different displays of those holy spaces that were taken apart and reassembled at the museum. And I think that my experience was that they still held that holiness, that sanctity, that kedusha, right? Because it's imaginal, but imagination is half the job as human beings, you know. And so, yes, I think it is absolutely possible, both from how important it was historically to the Jewish community in Burlington, to take the artifacts of that first building that was created by the immigrants as the place of their worship, which, oh, by the way, looks just like the churches in town as well, because it was all done by the same architect. There you go. I think it's a worthwhile effort for a variety of reasons. For those who experience the building, they'll walk in and go, ah, right? For those who've never experienced the building, they still might go, ah, but it will be for different reasons, because the artifacts themselves are interesting, especially with the history. You know, it starts out with a wooden ark, and then it gets covered, but with copper, and so built these, and da-da-da-da-da. Here's the Torah. So I think from both a psycho-spiritual perspective, as well as from a museum perspective, I think it's essential to continue to build on what's behind me right now and make that effort to recreate a space in which services can also be held, inviting different rabbis in, different lay leaders. Let it become, again, a part of the community. Someone wants to daven, they got a place here now. You know, it doesn't have to be rabbi-led. It could be all kinds of things. And so I think it would be just wonderful to recreate that space as best as possible, again, both from a historical perspective as well as the opportunity to create spiritual space that is a different layout, a different geography than the sanctuary on the other side of this wall. Well, that's not like, it used to be there were pews facing forward. Thank God the pews are gone, and we now have chairs we can move around. So, but yeah, I think it'd be a good idea.
Nice. So, excuse me, is there anything I haven't asked you that you'd like to talk about?
When I learned how to read chant Torah, it was here at Ohavi Zedek. And when I would take the yad in my hand and I began to chant from the Torah, I disappeared. And all I was the next person in the chain of people who had been chanting that Torah in that language, in that melody for thousands of years. And I was just doing the next chain. All ego dissolves. I am just there. That feeling of being in a holy space that is held other human beings, especially of this community. I mean, Ahavat Gerim has its own cemetery, right? from cradle to grave, that building served the Jewish community. And so when I would lead there, it was unavoidable, the feeling that I was just leading the next Friday night service. There was nothing special about me. It was all about us coming together to do Shabbos. And that remains just such a precious thing for me, especially as I'm stepping into emeritus status and handing the organization off to my two good friends, Rabbis David Curiel and Lee Moore, who are going to take Ruach HaMakom into its next iteration. It's ephemeral to be in a position to fill a space with human beings, sometimes dogs, fill the community in a room and allow the holy magic that happens when people come together in music, in song. That's my perspective as someone who loves to sing. And to allow the Torah to be read in that space. There's nothing special about it on a certain level. There is something profoundly special about it on another level.
Yeah.
And that is what so this Friday, we're Ruach HaMakom, I'm leading my last service as leader, and we're going to be at AG. We're going to be at Ohavi Zedek. We've rented it from Kidder. He's very kind. And
which isn't AG anymore.
Which isn't AG anymore, right. He owns a wonderful man. And my father used to say the dreidel dreitzach, the dreidel goes round and round. And so as we began in that building, Ohavi Zedek, I will end my time there also on this coming Friday. And the community is excited about that, not just because me, but because we get to be back in that building as Jews and Jew adjacents, because it was our building for so long, at least amongst the older generation. So I'm really honored and humbled by having had this opportunity to do what we've done. People who are charismatic do not necessarily have big egos. And that's me. I don't have ego. I'm just who I am. And through the work of so many people, yourself included, Shana, serving on our little board, serving, getting the dishes, doing the community really created the space. And that building, I always consider my womb. Mm-hmm. It's the womb of Ruach HaMakom. And it has that womb feeling, right? So it birthed a new part of the Jewish ecosystem. And 7 years later, Ruach HaMakom is part of the Jewish ecosystem in northern Vermont. And so that there really is something to carry on to the next leaders. Wow. That's a wow.
That's a wonderful place to end, I think.
Great.